I'm on my way to Reno, I'm leaving town today. Give my regards to all the boys and girls along Broadway. Once I get my liberty, no more wedding bells for me shall sing the band.
In the 1920s, Roy Curtis used his 8x10 view camera to document the little city of Reno between the mining boom at the beginning of the 20th century and the emergence of the gaming industry in the 1930s. In the process, he became one of Nevada's most important photographers, but he was even more. I'm Gwen Clancy with the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs, and in our program today, we'll take a closer look at the work of Roy Curtis, who was using a camera very much like this one here to document Reno in the 1920s. Largely forgotten today, Roy Curtis could well be America's greatest little-known photographer. Interest in historical photography has never been greater than today. In recent years, rediscovered commercial photographers have become posthumous superstars of the international photography world. Curtis might well be the next one.
What fascinates me about this picture is the beautiful detail, the embossed tin roof, and the things that you've found then in a drugstore. Also looks like there may be an early effort at electrifying the cash register here with the drop cord that's run down.
Roy Curtis fixed his lens on a range of subjects, including school classes, storefronts and interiors used in newspaper advertisements, mining and industrial views for annual reports to stockholders, and on-site portraits of the well-to-do.
I think the exhibit is actually wonderful. The photography is spectacular, and the fact that they have now digitally enhanced these photos, it's wonderful. It's also, what I like about it, it's great that they give me an idea, a visual idea of what was happening in Reno, Sparks, and the area in the 1920s.
Curtis, I think, is one of the few photographers that really left something behind, left behind a collection of their work. And I think there's a philosophy to it. They captured Reno as a crucial moment in history. Too many photographers, their photographs simply got lost. Somebody didn't think they were important and threw them away. So simply the fact that his legacy has survived, I think, is, of some importance.
At the same time that he was chronicling the history of Reno, he was also raising his own work to the level of fine art.
My favorite photos here today are the portraits. They're just wonderful. Although all of the photos are great, but certainly the one with the Native American mother holding the baby is, the tones are wonderful. The light coming in on her face is just almost perfect. Now this picture is a really good example. The gray tones, the white, the blacks are beautifully done, just beautifully done. It's just so crisp. The colors, the shades of black and white are so beautiful, and the tonal qualities are just great.
Well, to me, Roy Curtis is actually a major forerunner of what became modern photography. Curtis is doing in the year 1918 and on through the early 20s what wasn't done in fine art photography until mid to late 20s. And the style that he created is virtually the same in many ways as what became the great fine arts work by people like Walker Evans. But Curtis goes way beyond what typical commercial photographers were doing at the time in terms of the setting up of very complex images. For instance, here he has a cowboy with white hat, white shirt on a white horse in front of a dozen or so black horses. I mean, imagine how hard that is to set up. And of course, Curtis was working with an 8x10 camera so that he was setting it up on a tripod at a fixed position and a very slow film, slow shutter speed. So it's hard to get the kind of stop action that he succeeds in doing here with the horses fairly clear. And one of the things that he used earlier than many other photographers was a wide-angle lens in order to have more depth of field without the longer shutter speeds.
One question that, we often think of with that slow shutter speed in the old days is like you couldn't move. So how do you get a horse not to flick its ear, or there's one moving its tail?
Actually, films were getting a little bit faster by early 20th century, so that combined with the wide-angle lens, which had just become available to photographers of the time, he was able to get a much faster shutter speed than the 19th century photographers. Still not real fast. There's motion in the horse's tail, so the shutter speed was probably somewhere around a fourth of a second. And as if all that were not enough, of course, he manages to get the horse with a single white spot on the forehead to turn towards the viewer or the camera position, and captures that at just the right moment. This kind of perfection of catching the absolute correct moment became known as the decisive moment. And Cartier-Bresson in France was the most famous photographer to succeed in these kinds of split-second decisions as to when to take the picture. Another feature that is amazing about Curtis is how he takes very ordinary scenes and transforms them into the exceptional. In this scene we have a factory that is producing an engineering work that is producing a cyanide tank for the mining industry. It's to process gold ore. But in this photograph it looks like almost a cathedral, like it's a religious setting in which perhaps these people are involved in some kind of ritual activity rather than ordinary work. Curtis has a great ability to use dramatic blacks and whites, dramatic lighting. The high windows in the building, the sunlight filtering through those down to the bottom of the factory gives lighting sort of like in a cathedral with the high windows. And he notices this effect and uses it intentionally to create a dramatic image with contrast, dramatic contrast to black and white. In almost all of these, we scan the original nitrate negatives, nitrate negatives being the first plastic negatives, and unfortunately they also deteriorate through time. And so there's extensive restoration to be done on each of the negatives. They have incredible sharpness inherently, being large size, and also at the time modern photography equipment had just become available. So they're needle sharp, and they're just as good as anything today in terms of sharpness. So being able to scan those with a computer allows one to do even better quality actually than the original, because you can blow them up and capture more detail than was in the original prints.
Lee Brumbaugh, curator of photographs at the Nevada Historical Society, has spent many hours studying Roy Curtis's work and preparing the photographs and accompanying text for public display. We include next an excerpt from his writings in order to better understand the significance of these photographs.
Curtis's carefully composed images were more detailed than his clients needed, and at the same time more realistic than his clients might have preferred. In other words, Curtis was an artist. Curtis's role as an outsider, he'd moved from New York in 1916, may have allowed him to see his Reno subjects with increased objectivity and personal insight. In his best images, Curtis elevated each subject to the level of an archetype. His are not, however, casual or simplistic stereotypes. Curtis was clearly fascinated by each individual subject. At the same time, his perfection of the particular makes his subjects seem universal. The company office for the Reno Light, Water, and Power Company was located at 21 Front Street. The nature of the event documented here remains uncertain, but the scene has the appearance of vandalism. Instead of making a mundane record of the event, Curtis has transformed the scene into a powerful psychological drama that intermingles light and dark in the best film noir style. Curtis placed his bulky tripod-mounted 8x10 camera in the darkness at the rear of the office. His lens looks out on the demolished office and the shards of broken glass gleaming in the morning sun. To the right, a staircase shrouded in mysterious shadows, covered in dully glowing glass fragments, ascends into the unknown. Dimly, through the street-side picture windows, you can see the face of a man on the sidewalk peering into the office. Does this mysterious stranger represent the perpetrator returning to the scene of the crime, or does he represent the voyeuristic spirit in all of us? Through Curtis's transformative vision, this ordinary scene becomes a symbol for crime scenes and our fascination with them. In most cases, we do not know with certainty why Curtis made his photos. The majority of the business and work photographs were clearly done for advertising use. Owners of stores and businesses probably hoped real photographic images would catch the consumer's eye better than the pen and ink drawings more commonly used at the time. Reno's major downtown hotels also ran advertisements featuring Curtis's photos in newspaper supplements in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other cities. This view of a bedroom interior was certainly taken at a downtown Reno hotel, most likely the Hotel Golden. As in all of Curtis's images without people, the sense of human presence is made more powerful by their absence. In this regard, these images by Curtis foreshadow the work of such later photographic documentarians as Walker Evans. The Overland Cafe was located inside the Overland Hotel. Careful use of lines of perspective mark this lively photograph. The serried rows of napkins give the scene an animated aspect. The shape of the cleverly folded napkins is reminiscent of a soldier's helmet or clerical headgear, or even, by a more sinister pseudo-religious mimicry, the hoods of the Ku Klux Klan, which was flourishing throughout the United States in the 1920s. The automobile business was exploding during this period. Automotive dealers were among Curtis's most frequent clients. Sierra Auto Supply Company was located at 11 West Plaza Street. In this view of the first carload of Firestone tires shipped into Nevada, Curtis has carefully arranged them to animate an otherwise dull scene. They look as though they might have rolled up under their own power, a tire roundup, if you will. The image illustrates Curtis's recurrent use of repeated geometric shapes and diagonal perspective lines, leading the viewer into the photograph. Curtis had a genius for photographic composition. Although he used many of the same techniques in each photograph, he varied the nature of the elements and their placement so the images themselves do not become dull or repetitive. Many of Curtis's photographs appear quite ordinary at first glance. However, on closer inspection, details begin to appear odd, unusual, or even bizarre. This image of the interior of the Reno Hide and Fur Company appears quite ordinary, until you see that the glass case seems to hold a strange-looking creature with tentacles. The head-like shape in the lower right of the case looks like the remains of the creature's last meal. Perhaps it was a white poodle. The frequency of such allusions in Curtis's photographs suggests he may have intentionally included them for his own amusement and that of anyone else who might take the time to find them. Beside his usual honesty, Curtis displayed a fine eye for social irony, a quirky visual wit, and a penchant for the odd and enigmatic. As we have seen, objects in Curtis's photographs of business or workplaces are nearly alive in and of themselves. With the addition of people, his images become like stage sets. Some individuals seem to beam with pride in their work and joy with their position in life. In other scenes, the people appear almost existentially isolated, their relationships to other people ambiguous and taut with unspoken or perhaps unspeakable meaning. In part, this may be due to the necessity for the subjects to remain unmoving during the long exposure. But the clarity of Curtis's images and vision make the effect unusually startling. Curtis worked with an 8 by 10-inch camera, and film speeds were slow. Curtis also employed the newly invented wide-angle lenses to increase this front-to-back sharpness, or depth of field. However, wide-angle lenses distort the subjects, especially near the edges, and distort the image space, making near objects appear to be larger and far objects smaller. This is why the rooms seem to have a cavernous quality, and the people sometimes seem dwarfed by their surroundings. The fact that the people and places in Curtis's images are distorted just below the level of conscious perception is part of what makes them visually exciting. To this mix, Curtis adds interesting-looking or unusual people and locations. From a strictly documentary perspective, the acuteness of detail in Curtis's images is also a treasure. Every detail of business machinery and office paperwork is visible. Even the invoices and tally sheets on an accountant's desk are readable. Here we see the interior of the Conant Brothers store, the meat distributors of Nevada Packing Company. In 1932, the business was located at 759 East 4th Street. Typical of newspaper ads of the time, the scene depicts an Easter sale display and illustrates the abundance of consumer goods readily available in Reno. The photograph shows Curtis's moody and mysterious lighting, surprise details, such as the second butcher reflected in the mirror, and ambiguous interpersonal relationships. The owner or head butcher seems almost teutonically autocratic, while the face of his young assistant seems to register an expression of perpetual diffidence. Cavernous space, eerie lighting, and ambiguous personal relationships are frequent hallmarks of Roy Curtis's work. The owners of this drugstore stand stiffly at the rear, dwarfed to insignificance by the expanse of the shop. Curtis's use of a wide-angle lens exaggerates the effect. Although the couple seem to be husband and wife, they are separated both in space and by a profound emotional distance. At the center of the store, metal chairs circle several round tables, where fountain customers were served. The dim light of the room has shrouded this area with deep shadows that have a distinctly uninviting and even ominous quality. The image gives the feeling that if one's foot entered the shadow zone, it might not return whole. As usual, Curtis has set up his tripod and camera to record the Nevada Auto Supply Company at an oblique angle. This position allowed him to isolate the company sign against the sky. Interpreted as a fine artwork, the image seems to epitomize isolation and economic uncertainty. The dilapidated condition of the sign and its location on the edge of a visually empty space enhance this effect. The lack of customers and the image, typical of all Curtis shots, adds to the sense that the staff, encased behind the glass, are waiting Godot-like, not for proof of God's existence, but for the equally vital existential need, the arrival of a customer. The man in the photograph is taking a part off the shelf as he poses in the auto parts area of an unidentified garage, possibly the Firestone store. Curtis juxtaposes the real parts clerk with the cardboard image of the woman promoting tires in the advertisement to his left. Such visual wit was not typical of photography until the 1950s. Here a man poses at his desk in the office of the Mack Brothers automotive dealership. Curtis loves to include fanciful elements in his photographs to hold the viewer's attention. Here there is a poster from the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus in what would have otherwise been a dull image. The paperwork on the man's desk shows accounts for shipments of parts. One wonders if he is dreaming about what his life might have been like if he had run off to join the circus rather than becoming an accountant. Roy Curtis made this sensitive portrait of a Native American mother and her newborn child as part of a series at an unidentified Reno hospital in the early 1920s. The name and tribal affiliation of the young mother unfortunately have been lost. Curtis's exquisite photographic technique and the remarkable beauty of the woman combined to create a startling image. Curtis posed the new mother in what seems to be an empty, windowless room. The walls are blank and no light fixtures are present. One imagines that the glow of motherhood and the woman's natural beauty might have been all Curtis needed to expose the film. The automobile business was exploding during this period. The early 1900s were the pioneer days of motoring for most parts of the country, including Nevada. The first cross-country race by automobiles in 1903 was closer to Lewis and Clark's voyage of discovery than to modern travel. For much of the race in the West, the three cars were the first automobiles local residents had ever seen. Almost no roads were paved in 1903, and very few even by 1920. Photographs of Reno in 1907 show mainly horse-drawn carriages and wagons, not cars. By the early 1920s, the streets of Reno were lined with parked cars, although work wagons were still visible in many of Curtis's photographs of this period. Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line and mass production had made the automobile affordable for most Americans. An assembly line-built Packard model was the second car to cross Nevada, and the third to make it all the way across the country, also in 1903. In 1921, the Gove Motor Company of Detroit and Idaho planned to set up a Reno assembly plant for their economy model truck and roadster. For many years, Renoites posed with the new automobiles in front of the mansion of the late Senator George Nixon on California Avenue. Here, a woman dressed up in her best clothes poses with a Hudson coupe. The Phaeton convertible touring car was one of the Dodge Company's more luxurious models. These two images may show a husband and wife posing with their new automobiles, or, more likely, are advertising photographs made for the dealer. The commercial truck straddles Virginia Street south of the Washoe County Courthouse. The Riverside Hotel, which burned in 1922, is visible in the background. The image displays Curtis's typical use of strong diagonals to create a visually dynamic composition. Curtis's photographs are visual essays in the classic compare and contrast tradition. Here he compares the architectural shape of the truck's cab to the architecture of the courthouse. He further contrasts the modern mode of commercial transport to the old method, represented by a horse-drawn delivery wagon visible down the street. The photograph of the cowboy in the corral and the photographs of a Native American woman's new baby may well have been for newspaper stories. Until the 1940s, the main source of income for professional photographers was making portraits. During the 1930s, such national magazines as Life, Look, and Time appeared and began printing high-quality reproductions of photographs on slick or coated paper. In order to compete, local newspapers also began publishing more photographs. Some photographers were able to specialize in photojournalism, as it came to be called, or in the now lucrative fields of product and advertising photography. Curtis, however, was born too early to be anything but a photographic jack of all trades. Like all commercial photographers of his time, and most fine art photographers, Curtis ran a portrait studio. He also made group and individual portraits on location. The Nevada Historical Society's collections include Curtis photographs of social and service organizations, school classes, clubs and sports teams, families at home, as well as of individuals. All of the preceding photographs of workplaces with people are also portraits, whether viewed as historical documents or fine art masterpieces. The remarkable images of the young mother may well be among the finest portraits ever made. These were, however, created for advertisements or news stories, rather than for sale to individuals. Regardless of the commercial genre, Curtis had a genius for portraying individual personalities in relation to each other or their work in social environments. Similarly, within his group portraits, the individuality of personality revealed is astounding. You have the feeling that Curtis has captured far more about their inner natures than the subjects would have wanted, and probably in most cases, even more than they knew themselves. This photograph is of a men's organization, posing at a gathering at a restaurant or clubhouse during the month of December. They are wearing name badges, and Senator Tasker Audie is seated at a table toward the back on the left side. The photograph is of a young boys possibly from the YMCA basketball team or gymnastics squad. In an unusual move for Curtis, the group is posed in a straight line, parallel to the camera or viewer, rather than on a diagonal. In this case, Curtis creates an interesting image by contrasting the vertical figures of the boys and the carefully placed Indian clubs with a strong horizontal line of the school wall. The round ball provides a point of viewer focus and a visual contrast to the linear elements. Such concern for perfect fine art composition in group portraits is by no means normal. Most are satisfied with a usable likeness made as quickly as possible. In many of Curtis's images, human relationships seem enigmatic or distant. Here the homeowners, presumably a man and wife, stand on opposite sides of a tree on the far left. The rest of the family or household stand clustered well behind to the right. No indications of affection or emotional ties are apparent. The held-over Victorian somberness is heightened by the modern clothing styles. In his lifetime, Curtis was best known for his portraits of celebrities visiting Reno, which were often published in national newspapers. This unidentified portrait appears to show Hollywood socialite, champion equestrienne, and Nevada miner Alma Dorothy Priester. The image captures a well-groomed riding horse and the horse's equally well-groomed mistress. Curtis once more employs the technique of mirroring to create visual interest. He highlights both the visual and conceptual similarities between horse and owner. The visual similarities, minutely captured with his 8x10 camera, extend down to the almost identical texture of the horse's highly brushed coat and the woman's fine wool riding jacket. Oddly, the flawless duo is posed in a weedy, trash-strewn vacant lot. Our last photo is one of Curtis's most striking portraits. It shows a girl dressed as a cowgirl sitting on the corral fence at a Reno area ranch. The image is visually perfect in virtually every regard. The fact that it was taken with a light snow falling makes it all the more remarkable. The technical difficulties, wind, meltwater on the lens, and low light making it almost impossible to focus on the dim ground glass of the view camera were not only overcome, but completely mastered. Everything that should be in focus is, every aspect of the image around the young woman is perfectly composed. The plane of maximum sharpness perfectly intersects her eyes, freezing for all time her strikingly intense gaze. Her eyes are like the eyes of Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, except that they reveal not worry and desperation, but strength of personality in youthful vigor. This, then, is how Roy Curtis saw the Reno of his times, through a glass clearly, but clouded by mystery.
There was a time when South Dakota was the proper place, but when compared with Reno, it was never in the race. The only real Arcadia from Frisco east to
The Roy Curtis photograph collection is on temporary display in the Changing Gallery. For up-to-date information on current exhibits, please contact the Nevada Historical Society directly at 775-688-1191. Besides hosting changing exhibits, Nevada's oldest museum houses a wealth of material on the history of Nevada and the Great Basin, including permanent displays, newspapers, print files, maps, government documents, manuscripts, books, and photographs. The state of Nevada operates 7 museums for the public: the Nevada Historical Society in Reno, the State Museum and the Railroad Museum, both in Carson City, the East Ely Depot Museum, Lost City Museum at Lake Mead, the State Museum and Historical Society in Las Vegas, and the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City. The museums are part of the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs, along with the State Library and Archives, State Historic Preservation Office, and Nevada Arts Council. For more information, please visit nevadaculture.org or contact the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs at 775-687-8323. And see you next time on Exploring Nevada.